The maintenance shift had lasted 14 brutal hours. Gemma Wright dragged herself through the corridors of Station Valdris, her tool belt clanking against her hip with every step. Coolant stains decorated her jumpsuit like abstract art, and her shoulders screamed from hours spent in impossible positions, fixing plasma conduits that the station's insectoid engineers could not reach. She palmed open the door to her quarters, a modest space tucked in the outer ring between the cargo bays and the xenobotany labs. Most humans would have requested better accommodations, something closer to the station's core where the artificial gravity felt more stable. But Gemma preferred the solitude. Fewer neighbors meant fewer awkward conversations about why a human chose to live this far from civilization. Her stomach growled with such intensity that she almost laughed. The station's nutrient dispensers could provide everything a body needed, processed blocks of protein and carbohydrates that tasted like nothing at all. Efficient, yes. Satisfying, absolutely not. Gemma reached under her bunk and pulled out her secret stash. Over the past 6 months, she had carefully smuggled ingredients through supply runs and trades with passing merchant vessels. Real potatoes from an agricultural moon, carrots that actually crunched, onions that made her eyes water, and most precious of all, a vacuum-sealed package of real beef from a livestock ship that had stopped for repairs. She set up her portable heating unit and pulled out her battered cooking pot, a gift from her grandmother before she left Earth. The metal had dents and scratches, but it still worked perfectly. Gemma began her ritual with practiced ease. Oil heated in the pan. She cubed the beef and seared it until brown crust formed on every side. The meat sizzled and popped, releasing rich aromas that filled her tiny quarters. Next came the onions, chopped roughly and tossed into the pot. They softened and turned translucent, their sweetness blooming in the heat. Carrots and potatoes followed, along with a precious pinch of thyme she had grown in a hidden corner of the hydroponics bay. She added water and a beef bouillon cube she had been saving for months. The stew began to bubble and simmer, filling the air with a scent so profoundly human that Gemma felt tears prick her eyes. This was more than food. This was memory. This was her grandmother's kitchen on Sunday afternoons. This was harvest festivals in her hometown. This was every comfort she had left behind when she chose the stars over stability. She stirred the pot and hummed an old folk song, lost in the simple pleasure of cooking. The proximity sensor on her door chirped softly, but Gemma barely noticed. She was reaching for her pepper grinder when she heard it, a soft clicking sound like claws on metal. Then a low rumble that might have been a growl or might have been something else entirely. Gemma turned and froze. 3 figures stood in her doorway, and they were not what she expected. They were Drakkens, though calling them dragons felt more accurate. Each stood about 4 feet tall, with scales that shimmered between deep emerald and copper depending on how the light hit them. Their bodies were built like raptors, balanced on powerful hind legs with smaller forearms tucked against their chests. Membranous frills extended from their necks, currently folded flat against their bodies. Their eyes were large and golden, with vertical pupils that dilated wide as they stared into her quarters. The smallest one, whose scales showed more copper than green, held something in its forearms. A bowl, carved from what looked like compressed stone and decorated with careful etchings. The craftsmanship was remarkable, clearly made by hand rather than fabricated. Gemma's hand went to her comm unit instinctively. Drakkens were not dangerous, not exactly, but they were refugees aboard the station, survivors of a war that had scorched their homeworld to ash. The adult Drakkens kept to themselves, processing trauma that humans could barely comprehend. Their young were rarely seen outside their designated quarters. The smallest Drakken took a tentative step forward. Its frills fluttered slightly, exposing delicate membrane that glowed with bioluminescent patterns. When it spoke, its voice was high and uncertain, filtered through a translation device that hung around its neck. "Please," it said. "The smell. It is like before, like grandmother made." The other 2 stepped forward as well, each clutching their own handmade bowls. Their frills fluttered in unison, patterns of light rippling across the membranes in waves. Hope and longing Gemma recognized from the xenopsychology briefings she had skimmed. The patterns meant hope and longing. Gemma's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the 3 young Drakkens crowding her doorway. The smallest one, the one who had spoken, trembled slightly. Its scales rippled with colors she had never seen before, shifting from copper to pale gold and back again. The translation device around its neck crackled with static. "I don't know if you can eat this," Gemma said carefully, gesturing toward her pot. "Human food might be wrong for your biology. It could make you sick." The Drakken's frills drooped, folding tight against its neck. The bioluminescent patterns dimmed to almost nothing. "We can eat many things," it said softly. "Drakken digestion is strong. Before the burning, before our world became ash, grandmother cooked over fire. Real fire, not dispensers. The smell was like this, warm and alive." The other two nodded, their frills fluttering in agreement. One of them, slightly taller with scales that gleamed like polished jade, made a sound deep in its throat. Not quite a growl, more like a purr mixed with clicking. The translator interpreted it as singing, though Gemma heard no melody she recognized. She glanced at her stew, then at her tablet sitting on the counter. Her fingers moved quickly, pulling up the station database. Drakken physiology, dietary requirements, toxic compounds. The information scrolled past her eyes. Compatible proteins, yes. No allergic reactions to alliums or nightshades. Cruciferous vegetables could cause digestive upset but were not dangerous. Beef was actually recommended as compatible protein. Gemma made her decision. "Come in. Sit wherever you can find space." The three Drakkens scrambled inside with surprising grace, their clawed feet clicking against the metal floor. They moved like birds, heads bobbing with each step, tails extended for balance. The smallest one clutched its bowl to its chest like a treasure. They settled on the floor near her bunk, folding their legs beneath them in a way that looked uncomfortable, but which they seemed to find natural. Gemma ladled stew into each of their carved bowls, the rich broth steaming as it filled the vessels. She added chunks of beef, soft carrots, tender potatoes. What she had planned as a generous meal for herself became 4 modest portions. She kept the smallest serving for her own bowl. "It's hot," she warned, demonstrating by blowing across her spoon. "You need to cool it first." The 3 Drakkens mimicked her, their breath coming out in small huffs that created ripples across the surface of the stew. The smallest one dipped its snout toward the bowl, inhaling deeply. Its frills suddenly flared wide, the membranes glowing with brilliant patterns of orange and gold that pulsed like a heartbeat. It took a careful bite, using its snout to scoop up broth and a chunk of potato. For a moment, everything was still. Then the Drakken's entire body began to glow. The scales shifted through every color Gemma had ever imagined. Crimson joy, deep blue relief, purple gratitude, gold that shone like sunlight. The patterns moved across its body in waves, a language of light that needed no translation. The other two dove into their bowls with similar reverence. Clicking sounds filled the small quarters, along with the slurping of broth and the gentle scrape of carved stone against metal floor. They ate with focus and appreciation, savoring every bite as though it might be their last. Gemma took a bite of her own stew. The flavors exploded on her tongue, beef tender enough to fall apart, vegetables perfectly cooked, broth rich with herbs and thyme. But she found herself watching her unexpected guests more than tasting her own food. Their joy was infectious, filling her cramped quarters with something that felt almost like family. The smallest Drakken finished first, licking the inside of its bowl with a long purple tongue. It looked up at Gemma with those enormous golden eyes, and when it spoke, its voice was steadier than before. "My name is Torvin," it said. "These are my clutchmates, Ressa and Jevik. We came from Drakkar Prime before the burning, before the war machines came from the dark between stars and turned our world to glass." Ressa, the one with jade scales, clicked softly. "Grandmother raised us after our parents joined the defense fleets. She cooked every night over fire, even when the warnings came. Even when the sky turned red with ships. She said that as long as we could eat together, we were still alive. We were still Drakken." Jevik, the largest of the 3 with scales of deep amber, stared into his empty bowl. "The last night she made spiced meat with root vegetables. The smell filled our dwelling. Then the orbital bombardment began. Grandmother pushed us into the evacuation tunnels. She went back for the cooking pot. We never saw her again." The words hung in the air like smoke. Gemma felt something crack open in her chest, a grief she had been carrying without knowing it. She had left Earth by choice, seeking adventure among the stars. These children had been ripped from their world, had watched everything burn, had lost the one person who held their family together. "The food dispensers keep us alive," Torvin said quietly, "but they do not keep us Drakken. The paste has no memory. It has no love. It tastes like survival, not like home. Gemma set down her bowl. She reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement, and placed her hand on Torvin's scaled head. The texture surprised her, smooth and warm like sun-baked stone. The young Drakken leaned into her touch, frills fluttering with patterns of soft blue contentment. "I understand," Gemma said, and she meant it. The next evening, Gemma finished her shift early for once. A minor miracle on Station Valdris where something always needed fixing. She hurried back to her quarters with a spring in her step, her mind already planning the meal. She had traded 3 hours of overtime for a small container of chicken stock and some fresh herbs from a Centauri merchant. Tonight she would make soup, something warm and nourishing that reminded her of sick days at home when her mother would bring her steaming bowls of comfort. She palmed open her door and stopped short. Torvin sat outside her quarters, curled up against the wall with his tail wrapped around his feet. The moment he saw her, his frills flared with patterns of excited yellow and green. "You came back," he said, as if there had been any doubt. "Of course I did. I live here." Gemma smiled and gestured him inside. "Are Ressa and Jevik coming too?" "They wanted to, but Elder Shrix forbade it. He says we burden you. He says humans do not share food with Drakkens, that we must keep to our own kind." Torvin's scales dimmed to gray disappointment. "But I had to come. I had to know if yesterday was real or just a dream my grief invented." Gemma felt anger flash through her, hot and sudden. She had read about Elder Shrix in the station reports, the oldest Drakken survivor, the one who held their small community together through sheer will and tradition, a leader born from necessity, hardened by loss. She understood his protectiveness, but she did not have to like it. "Yesterday was real," she said firmly, "and tonight will be too. Help me cook." She taught Torvin how to chop vegetables, guiding his small clawed hands with patience. His fine motor control was remarkable once he understood the technique. Together they prepared chicken soup with rice, vegetables, and herbs that made the quarters smell like a grandmother's kitchen. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from shared purpose. The soup was nearly done when Gemma's door chimed. She opened it to find not Ressa and Jevik, but a tall Drakken adult whose scales were scarred and dulled with age. Elder Shrix. His frills were folded tight against his neck in a posture of stern disapproval. "I have come for the hatchling," he said, his voice a deep rumble that the translator rendered as formal and cold. "Torvin should not impose on your hospitality." Torvin's scales went pale with fear. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to become invisible. Gemma stood her ground. "He's not imposing. He's helping me cook dinner. He's welcome here any time." Elder Shrix's eyes narrowed to slits. "You do not understand what you do, human. You offer kindness that cannot be repaid. You create debts that will shame us. We are refugees, not beggars. We do not accept charity from strangers." "Then don't think of it as charity." Gemma crossed her arms. "Think of it as trade. Torvin helps me cook, and in exchange we share the meal. Fair exchange, no debt." The elder's frills twitched, patterns flickering across them too fast for Gemma to interpret. He stared at her for a long moment, then at the pot of soup bubbling on her heating unit. His nostrils flared as he caught the scent, and for just a second his stern expression cracked. Something ancient and painful flickered across his face. "That smell," he said quietly. "I have not encountered anything like it since the burning. How do you create such a thing from dispenser ingredients?" "I don't use the dispensers." Gemma ladled soup into a bowl and held it out to him. "I cook with real ingredients. The way my grandmother taught me. The way your people used to cook over fire." Elder Shrix stared at the offered bowl as if it might bite him. His frills rippled with conflicting patterns. Pride and hunger, suspicion and longing. Finally, with movements that spoke of great internal struggle, he took the bowl. He sipped the broth carefully, and his entire demeanor changed. His frills flared wide, glowing with patterns of gold and deep crimson. His scales seemed to brighten, reflecting light they had not held moments before. When he looked at Gemma again, his eyes held something new. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You have given us more than food," he said softly. "You have given us memory. You have reminded us that we are more than survivors. We are Drakkens, people of fire and feast, and we have forgotten what that means." He turned to Torvin. "Go, bring Ressa and Jevik, bring any who wish to come. Tonight we remember who we were before the burning. What happened next would become legend on Station Valdris." Torvin raced through the corridors, spreading word among the Drakken refugees. Within an hour, Gemma's small quarters overflowed with scaled bodies of all sizes. Adults and hatchlings crowded together, sitting on bunks and floor and any available surface. They brought their own carved bowls, each one a work of art that had survived the evacuation. Gemma cooked batch after batch of soup, her single pot working overtime. Other humans from the station appeared, drawn by curiosity and the unprecedented sight of Drakkens gathering in joy rather than grief. They brought ingredients from their own hoarded stashes, real bread, dried fruits, even a precious bottle of wine. The gathering grew beyond anything Gemma had imagined. Insectoid engineers contributed fermented nectar that paired surprisingly well with the soup. A Centauri family brought spiced flatbreads. The station's administrator, a being of pure energy contained in a crystalline matrix, pulsed with patterns of approval and contributed temperature-controlled storage for leftovers. Elder Shrix stood in the center of the chaos, his frills blazing with patterns that told stories without words. He began to sing, a deep thrumming sound that resonated in Gemma's bones. Other Drakkens joined him, their voices layering and interweaving until the song became something alive. Torvin translated for Gemma, his voice thick with emotion. It is the song of the feast fire. We sang it before every meal on Drakkar Prime. We have not sung it since the burning. Elder Shrix says we stopped being Drakkens when we stopped singing, but tonight, because of you, we remember. Gemma stood in her cramped quarters surrounded by aliens of a dozen species, all brought together by the simple act of sharing food. She thought about her grandmother, about Sunday dinners and the way love could be expressed through cooking. She thought about the human instinct to feed others, to create community around a table, to turn strangers into family through the alchemy of shared meals. This was humanity's gift to the galaxy, she realized. Not superior technology or military might, but this. The knowledge that food cooked with care and shared with open hands could heal wounds that weapons had created. That a meal could be an act of revolution. A declaration that even in the darkness between stars, warmth and connection could still exist. Elder Shrix approached her as the gathering began to wind down. He placed one clawed hand over his heart in a gesture of profound respect. You have taught us something we thought lost, he said. The burning took our world, but it did not have to take our spirit. Tomorrow we will cook again. We will teach our hatchlings the old recipes. We will remember that we are Drakkens, and Drakkens gather at the feast fire. He paused, his frills shimmering with patterns of gratitude. And we will remember the human who reminded us how to live.